Welcome to Agency Bytes, a podcast for agency owners, hosted by agency veteran and coach Steve Guberman. Agency Bytes is a podcast focused on delivering actionable agency information from agency experts in about 25 minutes. Why 25 minutes? Because who has the attention span for much more these days? And you can squeeze in a listen between meetings with time for a bathroom break or coffee refill before your next meeting.
Welcome to Agency Bytes, a podcast dedicated to helping creative entrepreneurs thrive. I'm Steve Guberman from Agency Outsight, where I coach agency owners to build the business of their dreams. Today, I am beyond thrilled to welcome the incredible Debbie Millman to Agency Bytes for our 100th episode. A little bit about Debbie, for those who may or may not know, but Debbie's been named one of the most creative people in business by Fast Company, one of the most influential designers working today by Graphic Design USA, and a woman of influence by Success Magazine. As the host of Design Matters, a Webby and Signal Award-winning podcast, and one of the first and longest-running podcasts in the world, Debbie is a true pioneer in the creative space. She's also the chair of the first ever Masters in Branding program at the School of Visual Arts, co-owner and editorial director of printmag.com, and the author of 7 books on design and branding. Debbie spent more than 2 decades at Sterling Brands, where she was the driving force behind its incredible growth from a team of 15 to over 150, leading the agency to become a branding powerhouse that was ultimately acquired by Omnicom. Her accolades are countless. She's a Cooper Hewitt National Design Award recipient, an AIGA Lifetime Achievement Awardee, and currently a Harvard Business School Executive Fellow. And just recently, she joined Canva's Design Advisory Board. As I was approaching my 100th episode, I knew I wanted to invite a guest who has made a profound impact in our industry and on me personally. And there was really only one person I could think of for this milestone. So I put out into the universe that I wanted Debbie to be on my centennial guest. And lo and behold, coincidentally, I met Steve Guberman, who was gracious enough to connect us. And here we are, Debbie. Welcome to the show. It's an absolute honor to have you here.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. And I'm really impressed by your research.
I re-listened to a dozen of your podcast episodes. I've been listening for 20 years. I'm like a huge fan. I have a couple of your books on the shelf behind me. I watched your most recent interview with Seth Godin. I've watched probably another maybe 2 or 3 of those. And so I just have been long time inspired by the work you've done, both as a creative professional, but in just the administrative part of the creative profession that we have. And so I was like, Mom or Debbie Millman for 100th guest. And so here we are.
I'm honored.
I have a handful of questions, and I typically don't pre-question things, but we'll see where this goes. And so I want to start because most of our listeners are agency owners, creative professionals. And I want to start asking about your time at Sterling. And early in my career, I knew of you and Sterling, and I thought you were the owner. And it wasn't until recently that I discovered you weren't the owner, but you took it from 15 to 150 and ultimately to an acquisition. And when a lot of owners come to me, say, Steve, I want to sell my business, coach me to get there. And they're not ready to sell at all, but we do the work to get them in the position to sell. And so I'm curious for you, leadership role as a creative professional, what were some of the essential characteristics that you had to bring forth in order to grow and be more hands-off over time and advise your team and guide them into this growth that you were experiencing?
Well, I was an owner. I became a shareholder in the company in 1998. So I got there in 1995. And my original offer letter from the senior partner, Simon Williams, indicated that if I had essentially performed well enough, that I would be eligible at the time for phantom stock. And in 98, so I got there and just really hit the floor running. I had already built a network of potential clients to pitch when I was at Interbrand right before, and left in 95 to go work at Sterling. and had a non-compete, so I had to manage through that. But I had a lot of people that I had been talking to that I hadn't gotten business from yet. So when I got to Sterling, I really was almost successful from day one. And I remember in that first year, I brought in business from Pillsbury, from General Mills, from McNeil Health, which owned Tylenol at that
Mm-hmm.
time. And unfortunately, we were getting fired from all of those jobs. Now, at the time, the design staff was primarily British because Sterling's original place of business, the birth of business was the UK. And so when they came here, a lot of the designers from the UK came along. And so there was a very British visual language to the work that we were doing, which eventually became coveted, but at the time was really hard to sell.
Sure.
And so we ended up getting fired. And at the time, I was really worried about my reputation. And Simon Williams, at that point, I had come in as senior vice president of BizDev, and then he promoted me to president of the design division. And then I was able to really influence the culture of our group. And so that was within 2 years. So the very next year, when we were gangbusters, I approached Simon and wanted to sort of check in with him about my potential for ownership. And he was at the time a little bit skittish about it. And, I loved my job. I was working 24/7. This was really my first big time continuous success. I had some at Interbrand, but it was a very different situation. Here at Sterling, I was making an impact. I felt like I was really reaching a place in my career that I had only dreamed about. And so in those initial years, that was all I wanted to do. I'd given up, and I talk about this, and that ultimately led to a little bit of a shift in how I was thinking about my creativity in the next decade. But initially I was just like, I'm giving up everything else and I am doing this full time, 24/7, no more painting, no more writing, no more guitar playing, no more anything, no more marriage. I'm just doing this. And I loved it. So when Simon at the time was really skittish initially, and who wouldn't be giving up shares of an organization that's suddenly turned a corner and is doing really well. So I did something that I don't even know how I got the balls to do. I said that if I didn't get shares, I would leave.
Wow.
Now, Steve, I went home that night and cried because I'm like, what the F did I just do? I loved this job. I didn't want to leave. And so it had just like popped out of me. And fortunately, he offered me some stock right at that point. And then over the decades that I was there, 2 decades, I kept getting an increase that was correlated with my performance. And so by the time we sold, I was the second largest shareholder at Sterling.
Wow.
And so, that was wonderful and life-changing and still something that I'm just incredibly grateful having the opportunity to do, because while I was really good at selling, somewhat good at managing, somewhat terrible at sort of details, so I had a lot of good people working with me, I don't know that I ever would have had the gumption to even consider selling. But that was Simon's goal from the beginning, which is why it was inserted into my offer letter. And so in regards to your first question, there were really 2 things. One was margin, because that was really, there were 2 things: margin and reputation. That's it. The quality of our work, the quality of our finances. And Omnicom was really, really strict about both. we hired a COO, an incredible man named Craig McCaffrey, who was based in Sydney, Australia, but came to New York to help us sort of get our margin in order. And he was both ruthless, but also kind.
Yeah.
And initially, I was really put off in working with him because suddenly everything was also a financial decision. And while I obviously wanted to make money, I was much more motivated by the design impact. So suddenly I had these two pockets that I had to consider. And while I always wanted the company to do well and be able to give bonuses and so forth, I wasn't hammering down on the margin to a degree that he was forcing us to do. But we got our books in order, and ultimately, Omnicom wanted us for both our design capabilities and our financial acumen.
Yeah, that's a tough line to juggle or tough line to balance, knowing you're passionate about the work and you want to do great work, but also the numbers guy is like, yeah, but you need to charge more for this. And do you remember like what the target margins were back then that you were chasing?
The minimum that at that time, this was 17 years ago. No, can't be. I'm going to do
27 years ago.
you know. I'm going to my calculator. Math isn't my heart.
We went to art school, not math school. We were told there would be no math.
17 years ago. It was 17 years ago.
Wow. Okay.
In 2008. So it's 2000 years, 17 years ago, 2008. The minimum margin was 26%.
Okay.
And now I think and even then, as we were, we had a 5-year earnout, they were really looking by the end at more like 32.
Good. Yeah, super healthy. And a lot of people say, oh, the bigger the agency, are the margins smaller? And the reality is 30% is 30%, no matter if you're $1 million agency or $100 million agency. So
I mean, you don't want to go cutting into the bone in
yeah.
order to get those returns. And sometimes you really do have to invest in order to be able to ultimately get those returns. But at that time, they expected, as the company they were acquiring, for us to have all of that in order.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, what a ride that must have been, for you, for the team that you brought along with you, and
Oh,
people
yeah.
I'm sure that you groomed along the way into their own leadership roles. You said, something about your management style a few minutes ago, of like, not great at details, okay at leadership. How would you define your leadership style in that environment?
By example, lead with
Okay.
example. I worked really hard. I
Yeah.
think that, I was told by a lot of people that I was always demanding, but always fair. Um, I learned a lot about leadership, obviously, working at Sterling. And to his credit, Simon Williams was very much into the best possible training for the staff. Certainly in the first decade I was there, we were always working with coaches and um, organizational psychologists
Hmm.
to really teach us. I mean, leadership is really messy, and everybody has a leadership style if they work at developing one. Um, I don't really believe that leaders are born. I do believe it's a skill. I mean, I think certain people are charismatic, and that can certainly help, but it doesn't always. Quite
Right.
a lot, quite a few of the best leaders were introverts, and there's always a different way that people communicate their power, and so we were really encouraged to find our own and use it for the betterment of the business.
Yeah.
Not to say that it was always easy. We sold the company in 2008. We sold the company in June of 2008. So if you remember back at that time, by October of 2008, the world was crashing.
Yeah.
So, we would not have been able to sell the company if we had spent another 3 months negotiating. No one knew that was coming, although there were signals, because I do remember at the time, a lot of commodities, the prices were starting to rise, like butter and milk and eggs and so forth. And everybody was like, what's going on? What's going on? And then,
Mm.
obviously the crash. So we had a 5-year earnout, which was very lucky, because if we had a 3-year earnout, that first year would have seriously impacted us, because after that, in that first year, I wasn't even sure we'd get another payment because of how
Sure.
bad. And so that meant really looking at how we were positioning ourselves, staffing, especially that first year you're owned by Omnicom and then the world falls apart. They're the first thing they're going to do is, what can we cut? And,
Yep.
we didn't want to be operating in that mindset. So that was really, really challenging. The year leading up to the acquisition was incredibly exciting, meeting with all the big wigs and making presentations to, John Wren, who was the chairman at the time, and all of the finance people. And we weren't just being courted by Omnicom, we were also being courted by a couple of other major holding companies, because our COO and our CEO, Simon Williams, were really, we were essentially offering ourselves and then hearing what those offers would
Sure.
be. And so
Yep.
we got 3 offers and we chose Omnicom. And that, was really heady, meeting with all these like super senior
Hmm.
executives that had, this giant responsibility of these large holding companies. We chose Omnicom, which was interesting because I had left Interbrand, which was part of Omnicom,
Mhm.
um, and so to go back was sort of had a nice symmetry to it. And I loved being part of Omnicom at the time. As the president of the design division, I was the most senior woman in the organization at Sterling, and so I became part of the Omni Women Network and was on the governing board, and met women who I'm still friends with to this day.
Sure.
And there was so much collaboration. I mean, I met Carl Heiselman, a dude, at Wolf Olins, and then we started collaborating. We did a fantastic project with Wolf Olins. We started working with the agencies that were working with Kraft, and so it was phenomenal. And then Omnicom also had an education program called Omnicom University. That was a collaboration between Harvard Business School and Babson. And I did that. I had 3 sessions in that. And that, expanded my brain power enormously. And that's where I met Frances Fry. And that's who invited me all these decades later to be part of the Harvard Business School Fellowship Program.
Wow. Full circle there.
Yeah.
You
You
and
live
you
long enough
mentioned,
and everything sort of connects.
yeah. Well, so you mentioned, I don't remember exactly what you just called it, but the Omnicom Women's Group,
Um, yeah.
Omni Women. I see you from a distance as such an inspiring female creative professional, and I try so hard to mentor, elevate, female students, professionals, entrepreneurs, etc. And so I how do you define that as part of what you do intentionally, or is that just kind of because, as you said, you were the senior most female creative, you just kind of fell into that? Like, is that something that you intentionally hold on to try and elevate other female creatives?
Well, I was an advocate for quite a few people within the organization. I always responded to people that were willing to work hard,
Hmm.
willing to grow, willing to challenge themselves, that were ambitious. Um, I spent a lot of time early on doing a lot of training, doing a lot of in-house positioning work to really understand the kinds of clients we wanted to go after, what kind of work we wanted to do. My particular fascination has always been with fast moving consumer goods. And so that had already been the concentration at Sterling. And so, I was interested in working with the biggest brands in the world. And so we had to adjust our pitch for that. And that was pre Omnicom. Once we were part of Omnicom, that was a real advantage because we were able to network within the various other agencies.
Hmm.
Um, but that was always my interest, and so I was really at the time committed to us all having the same values about the work we were doing. So
Yeah.
that was very, very intentional. Did I have a partiality to Certain kinds of people, yeah, I did. And the one thing that I can say is that I know that people were like, "Oh, Debbie has her favorites," and I did. I had my favorites were the people that worked hard, that were
Hmm.
really committed, that were extremely loyal to the organization, that were really profoundly committed to the betterment of the business, the betterment of the work. So yeah, I did have favorites. Um, Now, as an educator, I still have the same tendencies. I tend to also pay particular attention to women of color,
Hmm.
probably because I'm married to one,
Hmm.
and the LGBTQ community, which I'm okay with.
Absolutely.
I'm
I'm
okay
okay with it too, in case you cared. I absolutely think that's perfectly fine. Good for you.
with.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so shifting gears to your podcast, Design Matters. 20 years,
I know. By the time
mind
this
blowing.
comes out, when is this going to come out?
January or February of 2025.
Yeah, so February 4th, 2025 is my 20-year anniversary.
Mazel tov, congratulations. That's amazing.
And I
It's
started
mind
it at
blowing.
Sterling. I started it from my office in the Empire State Building, and I
Hmm.
loved that I could actually say broadcasting live from the Empire State Building, because most people that say that, most radio stations that say that, just have an antenna on the Empire State Building. They don't have their radio office. So I could legit say that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I used to pull down the shade in my office, close the door, and I remember, people being starstruck when like Malcolm Gladwell came through the door. So it was a really brand new, exciting, fun thing for me to do. There's not even a scintilla of knowledge at the time that I'd be doing this 20 years later.
I get it. I get it. I mean, I started this and I was like, oh, I'll do a few episodes and see how it goes. And I'm a fraction of the way through where what you've accomplished, not even, dropping the bucket, but I can understand how 20 years goes by and the amount of people you've touched with that podcast, the amount of just inspiring, humorous, educational, heartstring tugging content is just mind blowing. And
Thank you,
I'm
Steve.
curious. I haven't spent the time to compare early Debbie Millman interview style to recent interview style. I'm curious, have you seen an evolution in how you've interacted with guests over the years?
Oh my God. Don't go back and listen to the early episodes. They're unlistenable. They're unlistenable. First of all, when I started the podcast, I was doing the episodes, as I said, in my office. And so I was sitting facing my guests, probably 3 feet apart. So I was sitting in my desk chair. They were sitting on the other side. And we each were holding a telephone handset. So the echo that you were hearing at the beginning when we were setting up the tech today,
Yeah.
well, magnify that by 10 when, two handheld phones and the echo is bouncing back and forth. It was being then squished through a modem to my producers who were in Arizona. And so I often say that those early episodes sounded like episodes of Wayne's World. They were that
Wow.
bad.
Yeah.
And I don't even know why, like, early guests on the episodes are still friends with me. It was so bad. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I didn't grow up thinking, you know what, one day I want to be a podcaster. That was
Right.
not part of my purview. That was not even in my language. It wasn't even in the language when I started.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I've grown along with the podcast, and that's been probably what's kept me so interested in doing it, that it's a very different show than it was 10 years ago. It's a different show than it was 5 years ago. And if it wasn't, I'd probably be bored because I don't
Mm.
like to repeat myself so much. And the quality of the guests that I've had is just a gift. It's just a gift that people are willing to talk with me for an hour or two. And so I've learned so much and I'm so grateful. And my audience has stuck with me. And even when Apple changed the iOS and no more podcasts were being downloaded just organically once they were subscribed, I
Hmm.
still kept my good audience, and the show is still growing, and I'm still growing. So
Yeah.
can't ask for more than that.
So one constant, and you talked about this recently. One constant has been your closing. It says, we can talk about making a difference, we can make a difference, or we can do both. Where did that come from?
Well, back in 2004, I was writing for Armin Witt's blog, Speak Up, which was
Yep.
the very first design blog. Armin Witt created that, I believe, in 2003.
He was just on episode 92 last
Yeah.
week. So there
My,
you go.
my dear, dear, dear friend Armin. I am the godmother to both of his children.
Oh my God.
Yep, yep,
So beautiful.
absolutely. We had a very auspicious beginning because initially Speak Up was quite critical of me. But then I ended up becoming part of the fray and started writing for the blog. And there was a conversation back then. It was very spirited, hundreds of comments, hundreds of participants. And there was a conversation about, I think it was poster design, and do posters really make a difference? The same conversations we still have about design. And so people were talking about, do they make a difference? And I said something like, well, we can talk about making a difference or we can make a difference. I wrote that. I had no memory of that. Armin had a poster contest where people had to find a line from the podcast, from the blog, from any of the conversations. They could pick anything they wanted and make a poster out of it. So Don Hancock, the great designer, Don Hancock, the founder of Firebelly in Chicago, picked that phrase. We can talk about making a difference or we can make a difference. And she made a poster out of it. And I was like really chuffed, like, oh my God,
Sure.
this is amazing. And it was exactly at the time of my launching the podcast. And so I thought, oh, this is such a great sentence, but what if we can do both? What if we can talk about making a difference and make a difference? And so talking about making a difference was talking about making a difference on the show. And then making a difference was with our behavior after. And so that's what I decided to use. And I have used it ever since. It's the one, aside from my being the host, it's the one constant.
And it's perfectly apropos because you talk about making a difference on your show and in all the things that you do in your career and in your life and your marriage and everything. And then you also actively do that in all of those areas of your life as well. So yeah, it couldn't be more perfect.
Thank you.
Your recent interview with Seth Godin, the live one for Creative Mornings, you talked about a flashback again 20 years ago. You had a class with Milton Glaser, and he introduced you to the mindset of scarcity and abundance. And you briefly talked about that, but I'm curious, how did that education or like what he opened your mind to shift your path in life based on decisions you made, based on scarcity and abundance?
Well, that was a really defining experience for me. And I can say, in the same way that I can say Speak Up was my experience with Speak Up was a defining moment. In many ways, the even Speak Up led me to the class with Milton because through my relationship with Speak Up, I then started writing for print magazine. When you were a writer for print magazine, you'd get an early copy of the magazine directly from the publisher or the printer. And in that issue of, I think, my first article, there was an ad for Milton Glaser's summer intensive at the School of Visual Arts. This was long before I started teaching there. And because I had an early issue, I was the first person that signed up. And it was a first come, first served kind of a situation. It wasn't something you had to apply to. You just paid and you got in. So it was like the first 30 people. And lo and behold, I was in that class. And it changed everything for me. It changed everything for me. First of all, being taught by Milton Glaser was such a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike Seth, who didn't really enjoy the experience that much, I lapped it up. I was in heaven. And I hadn't really ever thought about the world between the continuums of scarcity and abundance. And when he said that, I realized that I had spent pretty much my whole life thinking that this was the only chance for anything I was offered or fighting for, and held on to it so tight. And that was not the only major shift. The other big shift was my participating in the exercise that he had all of his students do, which was writing your 5-year plan for your future self. And he asked us to write, it was the culminating exercise in this intensive. And he asked us to write an essay as if it were 5 years into the future, envisioning a life where we could do whatever we wanted with it. And it wasn't a process exercise, it was a visioning exercise. So don't think about how you're going to make it happen. Just assume it's happened already.
Right.
And so I wrote this essay. I put my whole heart and soul into it. He said it was a magical exercise and that people were always contacting him and telling him how powerful it was. And I just believed it hook, line, and sinker, and was so desperate for a different kind of life that I'm like, oh, if this is magic, sign me up.
Yeah.
And it was, and it wasn't. It was magic in that I had I had everything. It took more than 5 years. It actually took 13 years for everything on my list to happen. But the fact that it happened at all is still incredulous to me. And they were big goals. They weren't like, oh, I want a better relationship with X, Y, and Z, or, oh, I want to get a new car. They were really big. And now looking back, it's incredible to me that I was able to receive those things. And I really, truly believe that I have Milton to thank for that, because he gave me the courage to consider other possibilities. And now those possibilities are the fabric of my life.
Wow.
So he stopped teaching a couple of years before he passed, and I asked if I could, because I at that point, one of the things on my list was teaching at SVA, and that happened within like a year of my taking this class, which had no correlation. It wasn't because I took the class that I was able to get a position at SVA, but I asked him if I could start teaching that exercise. So I got his permission, and I extended the year. So rather than 5 years, because most of the people in his class were working professionals. Most of my students were like seniors in college. So it was a very different scenario. And because it took me so long, and I was still in the process at that point. I didn't even know if those other things were going to happen, but it was, on its way to the 5-year point. I asked if I could change it to 10 years. And so that's what I did. And that's still is. So I teach both my grad students and my undergrad students at SVA this exercise.
I think it's a beautiful exercise. It's something that I've done for a lot of years. And the ability to visualize and manifest the things that you want in your life and the impact you want to have on other people. I just think it's so beautiful. And then when you're able to step back and say, oh, these are the things that I want to have happen, or where I want to go with life. And then you can kind of reverse engineer them and nerd out about the activities that'll get you there. And
Right.
to me, like, I see Milton as just a super impactful designer. Some of the marks that he's put into the world and things like that. I honestly never would have thought that he would have been like deep on that level to introduce an exercise like that. And so that's really, really beautiful.
He was a really great teacher,
Yeah.
And he often said that teaching was actually the most important thing that he was doing with his life.
I believe that. Yeah. So on that topic, a few years ago, somebody came out with a new I Love New York logo.
Oh yeah.
An updated version with an emoji heart. Did you have any response to that?
I don't think it was a redesign.
It was a floated concept.
Yeah, it was like sort of an extension of sorts. Like they were really, really clear, I think, that it wasn't a redesign, that it was a way of using the heart in this new campaign. I don't know. It was I don't like to say bad things about people's work unless they're mean to me. It was okay. It doesn't have the staying power of iHeart York. I mean, I
I
travel all over the world now, and there's no place I go that there isn't an iHeart
Yep,
Lisbon or an iHeart, Saudi Arabia. There's an iHeart for everything now,
that's
and I
true.
don't think it's going to be We Heart
Yeah.
uh, Dubai anytime soon.
God, I hope not. Yeah. So thinking about all that you've accomplished and all the impact that you've had, tons of accolades, walls of awards, I'm sure. And I don't necessarily love this word, but I think it's just a good way to define it. Can you talk about a failure or a setback that was impactful for you?
I have so many, I don't know if I would say failure or setback. I would say I have a lot of rejections, and I still have a lot of rejections.
Hmm.
You
How
know,
do
the
you deal
only,
with them?
I cry, I wallow. We metabolize all of our feelings. So one thing I have learned with age is that feelings don't last forever.
Right.
Um, they change all the time, and we metabolize so many of our feelings. And I think that, if you feel heartbroken, the best thing to do is allow yourself to feel heartbroken so that you can begin to work through the heartbreak. So, I used to get a lot more angry when things didn't go my way, but really underneath anger is just grief and
Hmm.
sadness. And so finally, thankfully, I just feel sad when things like that happen, and I get really down on myself and catastrophize a bit, and feel like nothing's going to ever work again, and back into that scarcity mindset. But I tend to pull myself out because I have had enough of them to know that it's not forever. And there
Hmm.
is going to be somebody somewhere that does appreciate what I do. And, you can't win, mostly you can't win awards unless you apply to win,
Hmm.
so the Signal Award or the Webbies and so forth. So, I don't win every year. And I was nominated 10 times before I actually won a Webby. And so every
Wow.
year I was like, oh, I'm never going to win. I'm never going to win. I'm never going to win. Always a bridesmaid, never a bride. And even now, that I have won, I'm like, should I apply again? Because if I don't win, I'm going to be really bummed that I haven't won. But then I've already won. So shouldn't somebody else win? And, it's all of this inner crap.
Yeah.
And I write things that don't get approved, or they don't get printed. And there are times when I get really down on my ability, and or I'm envious of other people's, and then I just have to remember that that's stupid to do. Social media sometimes makes it hard not to compare.
Yep.
So I just feel what I feel and get over it.
Yeah.
I
Grief
don't
teaches.
I generally don't try to contain it, like, in my own personal private life. Like, Roxanne
Yeah.
gets a lot of my tears.
Yeah, the people closest to us, they get the brunt of it and they help us, comfort us through it. And I agree that I think grief is such a great life lesson on how to deal with rejection and the things that we get angry about is inability to accept what reality is and what's happening. And so it's really good to hear that you also experience the same kind of imposter syndrome and all the feelings that we all feel, and all these feelings are so temporary, so we just have to remind ourselves. So yeah. Curious about your where you get inspired from, and you inspire so many women, young creatives, entrepreneurs, people in our industry. Where do you draw from? You talked about earlier, like you poured everything into your career and you put aside the fine art and the music. And I know these are back in your life now, but like, where do you draw your inspiration from?
I have to say, just through the world, because I'm not looking for inspiration. I'm not seeking, oh, that museum show is giving me inspiration.
Mm,
I try to experience as much as I can, and then try to be open to what that might inspire in me. But I guess if I had to pick one thing, I would say travel. I decided in my mid 50s that I was going to try to see as much of the world as possible in the rest of my life. And I have been trying to do that. I've gone on a couple of National Geographic expeditions,
wow.
on an expedition to Antarctica. Um, and so those experiences inspire the little visual stories I do on Instagram. I recently went on a trip, on an excursion, and rather than write stories about the places that I was going to, I just did visual essays. I did one on birds, I did one on butterflies. So I find a lot of inspiration traveling and experiencing different cultures. That being said, I also get a lot of inspiration from reading. I read a lot. I love to look at art. I love live theater of any
Mm.
kind. I love live theater. So, I get inspired by people I work with. I get inspired, I do a lot of work with Mariska Hargitay. I get really inspired by her.
Mhm.
And then, of course, my wife, who's like the most inspiring person on the planet.
Mm. I loved the way you walked through the story of your romance with her. I think it was on a Brene Brown episode, or maybe you were on her podcast, one or the other.
She, she,
I
she, she actually invited Roxanne and I together and we talked about it.
That's what it was, yeah. And it was at a time, I believe, when I was starting to fall in love with my now fiance, and just an absolutely inspiring story, and just your transparency and like all of it. I'm in love with Brene Brown and everything that she talks about as well.
Oh,
And so
yes.
the whole thing just carried me and lit me up. And so I was so grateful for all of those stories that you shared and every bit of the romance.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. It's
Yeah.
the best thing that's ever happened to me.
You deserve it. That's amazing. You absolutely deserve it. You both do.
Thank you. And it was in my second 10-year plan. So
Okay,
I
so you did it again, and that came about in
did
the second
one
one.
in 2017. It was 12 years later. And at that, remember I told you at year 13. So at that point, I was starting to feel like, oh, maybe I should write another one. And I put it off and put it off and put it off. And so because I gave myself a deadline of the end of the year in 2017, I literally stayed home New Year's Eve and did it New Year's Eve 2017. So into the first day of 2018. And Roxanne and I had our first date October 9th, 2018. And
Wow.
in my plan, I was like, I really, really want to find my true love.
Mm. But imagine that, a creative professional hitting the deadline at the last minute. That's just
Right.
how we operate.
Yep.
Nothing wrong with that. What's next other than 20-year episode on February 5th? What's next big stuff for you?
Oh, I have such a big thing coming, Steve. I'm so excited about it and nervous too. I've written another book. It'll be out April 15th.
You can pre-order it now online, folks. I got mine, and you should get yours.
And it's called Love Letter to a Garden. And it is a visual story about my quest throughout my life to be able to grow things,
Mm.
live things like plants. And it's part memoir, part visual story. And it's been the most fun I've had as far back as I can remember making this book. It's all drawings and paintings and photographs, and it has a bit of my travel in there and plants and flowers and all kinds of flora that I've experienced seeing over the last 10 years. Um, and that'll be out. And I hope the world likes it as much as I enjoyed making it.
I'm sure they will. I'm a nerd gardener and tons of flowers and plants in the house. And so when I saw you announce the pre-order, I'm like, if this is anything like anything you've put out before, I need to have this in my possession. And I remember, I think it was your Design Matters book, where all the photos that you had taken, like
No, I
how
didn't take
proud.
them. I photo edited them. I
Photo
didn't.
edit. Okay, yeah, yeah. And so I remember you talking about that, and I was like, this new book is right up my alley. So yeah, I'm excited for it.
Thank you.
Are you
Yeah.
guys gardeners, or is it more the attention
I
to
am.
be?
I'm a
Okay.
gardener. So basically, I have had outdoor space in Manhattan since the early 90s. That was always one of the things that became sort of a prerequisite for wherever I wanted to live. And I
Hmm.
gave up neighborhood for outdoor. So for many, many years, I lived in what was considered kind of a crack neighborhood. But then it changed and evolved over the years to a highline neighborhood. But prior to that, it was a pretty intense drug block. But it was the only apartment that I could afford that also had outdoor space. And so I had tried over 3 apartments to have a garden, and it was always super challenging, and I didn't know what I was doing. And over the decades, just kept trying and mostly failing. And then COVID happened, and Roxanne and I decided, because her house when we met was in LA, mine was in New York, that we'd be in LA for this time together. We'd have cars and the ability to see more sky and so forth. And so I started a garden in her house, which is now our house because we live together, obviously. And that was sort of the expansion of my heart in even sort of bigger and more meaningful ways, because suddenly I was growing things we were eating successful. And even now, one little lime plant that I had, I then ended up planting in the ground. And this is the first year, it's been 5 years. This is the first year we'll have a major harvest of limes. I'm looking at the tree right now through my window, and it's like mind blowing that this has happened.
I love that. I got into gardening through the grief process after losing my daughter, and it was literally the grounding place I needed. And the work that I did in the garden and nurturing something to life and killing things also. And now fast forward 5 years, we get so much gratitude out of the bountiful harvests and the food we make and filling our freezer with soups and things. And so I fully relate that, it is our heart that we put into this thing. The joke is, you spend all this time and money and you save $3 at the grocery store by growing all these tomatoes, but it's rejuvenating. And yeah, I'm excited for your book.
And I'm really sorry about your daughter. I didn't know that, and I'm truly, truly sorry.
Thank you. I'm not going to hold you hostage too much longer, but I typically will wrap these up with some random rapid fires. But I'm not going to give you the same ones that I give other people, because this is number 100, and you are a different type of guest for me. So first is super simple. What's your favorite typeface these days?
Oh my God, such a good question. I have a soft spot for a really dumb old typeface, which has been my go-to answer because it's still my favorite. It's the typeface used in the Mary Tyler Moore opening title, and it's called Peño. And it was one of 3 typefaces I had in my college newspaper. So it was always the headline type, or mostly always. We had Gaudi, Souvenir, and Peño. I still have a spot in my heart for all 3.
I believe it. Okay, cool. What's one of the most gratifying campaigns that you've ever worked on?
Oh, the Joyful Heart Foundation, to try to eradicate the rape kit backlog and sexual violence. Also the No More work I did, which preceded my work on the Joyful Heart campaign, or the Joyful Heart work. I'm now on the board of the Joyful Heart, and for many years was the chairperson of the board. But the work that I did for No More and then the Joyful Heart Foundation is probably the most important work I've done.
Love that. And then finally, and I hate saying finally because I feel like we just hit record, but if you could go back in time and give the younger version of Debbie some advice, what would that be?
Believe in yourself. Don't compromise. You can do anything you put your mind to. Try not to think that every opportunity is the last one, because it won't be. See the world from abundance and not from a point of view of abundance and not scarcity.
I love that. Debbie, thank you so much for joining me, for joining whoever's listening out there in podcast world, and for all the work that you've done. As long as you've been on my radar, 25-ish years. You've been an absolute inspiration to my career and my creative profession and some of the hard work that I've done as well. And so I'm just so grateful for you and for your time today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a heartfelt, beautiful conversation, Steve. I'm really, really grateful to have had this time with you.
Me too. Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning in to Agency Bytes. If you know someone with expert knowledge on a topic that agency owners would love to hear about, go to agencyoutsight.com/podcast-guest and nominate them.